Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to this event, African Regional Champion, Ghana and Freedom of Expression. And the question, Africa Regional Champion, is posed as a question. I'm the director of the Institute for Commonwealth Studies here at the University of London, Kingsley Abbott. And this event is being held as part of our program of work under the Institute's Media Freedom Initiative. And I want to begin by saying a very big thank you to Dr. Kiran Hassan for organizing this event and for bringing all of us together here today. We're very fortunate to be joined by three excellent speakers who will each speak for about 20 minutes on the issue. The first is Dr. Abina Anenwa-Yeboah Banin from the University of Ghana, David Kwaku Saforo Saki, well-known media presenter, Richard Duomo, who's a PhD student at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And following each presentation, we'll have a few minutes to enjoy a question and answer session. In January this year, Ghana underwent its fourth Universal Periodic Review at the UN Human Rights Council, known as the UPR. And as many of you know, the UPR is a unique process which involves the periodic review of the human rights situation of all the UN member states. And at the end of that process, states make recommendations to the country in question, which it then responds to, and the state is expected to comply with the final outcome document. And the review is very much based on material submitted to the working group of states, including from civil society and from the UN country team. Now, in the UN country team report of November 2022, just a few months ago, last year, the UN country team noted that Ghana had been ranked 60th in the 2022 World Press Freedom Index, which was a fall of 30 places compared to the previous year. And that decline suggested that a re-examination of the commitment to freedom of speech embedded in the notion of human rights in the Constitution and the global commitments for which Ghana had such a strong and positive reputation was necessary. And that would involve the prosecution of crimes against journalists to curtail impunity and guarantee their safety. And UNESCO recommended that Ghana decriminalize defamation and adopt relevant legislation that was in line with international standards and respond to the UNESCO Director General's annual request for information on the judicial follow-up to killings of journalists. At about the same time, Reporters Without Borders has noticed that this World Press Freedom ranking, a drop of 30 places to 60 out of 180 countries, is the worst ranking that Ghana has received in nearly 20 years. And it also noted that the information minister had pledged to keep promoting press freedom and journalist safety. So these assessments by the United Nations, by civil society, by Reporters Without Borders raise a number of questions, including why have we seen this drop in press freedom in a country which has previously had such a good reputation for freedom of expression, and what needs to be done in the future, and what indeed is being done? Has the information minister's pledge been acted upon? So to discuss these issues, our first speaker is a senior lecturer at the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Ghana. She's an experienced strategic communication practitioner with over 15 years of teaching and practice experience. She has research interests in advertising, media development, and gender. She's also the lead investigator of the recently launched State of the Ghanaian Media Report commissioned by the US Embassy. So welcome, Abina Anenwa-Yeboah Banin. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation to share my thoughts on whether indeed Ghana deserves the accolade African Regional Champion when it comes to press freedom on the continent. I think that there are things to be said for both sides of that question. So in some ways, Ghana does deserve the notion of it being Africa's regional champion on press freedom. But there are other ways in which we identify fault lines that should make us concerned as to the prospects of Ghana continuing as a champion for press freedom and also as a safe haven for practicing journalism and media work broadly. Thank you also for the nice introduction. Kingsley has set a good foundation for me really in painting a picture of where Ghana stands in the broad scheme of things at a global level when it comes to media freedoms. And so I will not belabor the point and go in the direction that he did. But if you narrowed the picture down to Ghana within Africa, well, he's told us that we ranked 62nd this year in the World Press Freedom ranking, having moved from 60th. But the bigger picture is worse, because really, if you track things from at least 2018, when we hosted the World Press Freedom, and I was excited to have been part of the National Planning Committee for hosting this World Press Freedom. At the time, we were ranked 23rd, and we made a lot of noise about having gone ahead of the Americas and the UKs in that ranking. Fast forward just about 5 years, and we've moved about 39 places downward. So the story is not that encouraging. It's not that complimentary of our so-called position as a press freedom haven, if you wanted to be very, very populist about it. Indeed, not only have we moved 39 spaces downwards, but sometimes the picture is also quite bleak if you compare to other countries on the continent. And I single out particularly the case of Burkina Faso, which is under a military rulership and which did better than Ghana in the African ranking. So in terms of contemporary situation in Ghana when it comes to press freedom, one may say that things are not doing as good as we would wish. In spite of that, however, wherever we go, I mean, when I go to conferences and I meet other African countries, they feel very excited that I'm from Ghana because, oh, you're from Ghana, the place where you're doing your democracy so well. You're from Ghana, you guys have it so good. And we are at pains to explain that actually things are not that glorious as they seem to have. So there's some extent to which perhaps there's a certain past glory that we're living with. And that continues to let people think that we are the press freedom champion, at least so far as Africa is concerned. But there's reason for that perception, if I may argue. As the MFWA tells us from their 2023 paper, there's a steep decline across the continent when it comes to press freedom. So it would appear as though Ghana's positioning and perceptions around it are perhaps a bit of the picture where we have the one-eyed man in the land of the blind. So Ghana is the king simply because it's a one-eyed man living in a land where everybody else is blind. If Africa is in steep decline so long as press freedom is concerned, then that place where there are, if you like, romanticized notions of our press freedom credentials make us still stand tall amidst all the African countries. And as MFWA tells us, about 40% of all African countries are classified as having an environment of bad press, so it's not that safe for people to do journalism work. But I paint this picture of perhaps Ghana as a one-eyed man in the land of the blind, not also because it stands on emptiness. Ghana does come to this perception of an African champion of press freedom with some very solid credentials, I might argue. So we have a constitution, the chapter 12 of which is solely dedicated to the media and media freedoms to make sure that media is separated from control of the political class, to make sure that media can operate independently. It sets up separate regulatory entities to make sure that really journalists and media practice people can do their work in an environment that is free from control. So that, I think, it's something that puts us or stands Ghana in good stead every time anybody wanted to talk about press freedom. If you visit Ghana and you listen to radio particularly, but other media, you would also notice that we have quite a very pluralized media space. As we speak, we are above 500 radio stations operational, about over 100 TV stations. In fact, in the State of the Ghanaian Media Report, we make a point about there being media saturation. The populace is overserved with media. But I mean, if you come from a country where there is controls on media and there isn't liberalized media spaces, then it is very easy when you meet the Ghanaian media landscape to become very excited about how free it is and then just how open and available media is. And also the discourses on these platforms can get highly politicized, zealous. People really can feel free and say very, very hard things, contentious things, and oftentimes get away. And so it is easy for any observer to get excited about just how free the Ghanaian media is. In 2019, we've also passed, never mind the fact that it took us 20 years to get there, we've passed the Right to Information law that allows ordinary people, but also journalists, to go to public organizations and request for information without even having to give reason for the information they're requesting. You can just go in there and put up a request, and that public institution, coming from the orientation that it is funded by the public, is obliged to give information to you. Of course, I'm sure when we get to the question and answer session, we'll see the fault lines in the implementation of the RTI. In 2001, also, we decriminalized speech, at least by aborting the then criminal libel law. Again, the Q&A session, we see how perhaps, even though on the books it's supposed to have been decriminalized, other laws are being taken advantage of to still criminalize speech. And of course, the digital has also come to open up the media space. There's more participation, there's more space for people to venture in and start their own media ventures. But there's also really a bigger space for people to participate in civil discourses. So I think that these credentials are what make Ghana still stand tall and look attractive as the African regional champion, even in spite of its many fault lines. And of many fault lines there are. So I here speak about some of the evidence of deteriorating press freedom conditions in the country. According to our State of the Ghanaian Media Report, nearly a quarter of all journalists feel unsafe to do their work in Ghana. They just feel, I might be the subject of attack for doing my work, you know. These attacks that they're subjected to come in different folds according to the report, and also by an earlier study from the MFWA. There are threats, there are actual attacks, there are arrests and detentions, including sometimes unwarranted court-sanctioned detentions, killings. We've seen 1 or 2 people being killed. Sometimes media houses are shut down. Sometimes journalists have their equipment being seized, destroyed by people who think that their work puts them in a bad light. So while the credentials we come to the table with so far as press freedom look very good, at the same time on the ground and in reality, everyday experiences of media people, there is evidence that they're getting attacked, and there's a growing sense of fear among these professionals. For me, one of the clearer signs that the picture on the ground is not so healthy is the fact that in 2021, our Ministry of Information and our National Media Commission collaborated to create the Office of the Coordinated Mechanism for the Safety of Journalists. So this is supposed to be an office that would receive reports on safety attacks and hopefully follow up to see that justice is done. I think that just the fact that we got to a point where we needed an office to coordinate this tells us that it was increasing in its occurrence, and so there needed to be attention there. And that is worrying. I do not worry about the existence of the office. I worry about what it signaled. The need that it came to address is what perhaps is worrying for me. So the evidence when it comes to press freedom conditions in the country, not too satisfactory. Perpetrators, we're seeing security officers. You would imagine those would be the ones to protect journalists for doing their work, but oftentimes they are the ones attacking. Politicians are attacking, business people are attacking chiefs. We've seen an uncomfortable trend where chiefs are stepping in when media organizations operating within their localities have done something that they find not pleasing to them. And they will go after these media organizations, sometimes asking them to shut down. And if you don't shut down, the people within the locality who owe allegiance to their chief, and they should, would then come after you. Sometimes it is religious fanatics that are perpetrating the press freedom violations. Where do all these things come from? So these pieces of evidence we're seeing that culminate into a general picture that the press is not that free in Ghana, and for which reason we keep falling low on the World Press Freedom rankings. I think that our structural fault lines, because that's what the conversation invites, I think that our structural fault lines can be positioned on three key nodes. There are industry dynamics, I think. There are illegal issues, but there are also individual level factors. Regarding the industry dynamics, as I said earlier, in our State of the Ghanaian Media report, we explained the fact that, particularly in the chapter on media ownership and regulation, we make the point that there is a saturation. There's just too many media houses, if you're talking 500 radio stations and over, competing, and most of these are commercial, so they have to raise their resources and fund their activities. And Ghana has a small economy, an economy that, as I speak, has gone to IMF, for one thing. And so the size of the economy is not big enough to provide the advertising budgets, and that's how most of these media houses fund themselves, the advertising budgets by which to run. That being the case, media organizations are quite not viable from a business, from a sustainability point of view. The picture doesn't look too healthy. And I think that because of that, it makes them susceptible to poor practices, which then open their employees or their journalists up to attacks. So that is a concern. The journalists themselves, because their media organizations are not that financially viable, are also very, very poorly paid. And when somebody is poorly paid, sometimes they can become insignificant in the eyes of the people who have big monies and who perhaps sometimes are the ones also perpetrating corruption. And so it's easier for them to be the subject of attacks. Again, at the industry level, we've seen a trend towards, and we argue that in the State of the Ghanaian Media report, we've seen a trend towards political capture particularly. So virtually every politician worth his or her salt in Ghana now owns a media organization. They've become players as much as they are in parliament and are supposed to be promulgating the laws for regulating the space. And so it is difficult when there are problems in the media for them to stand up and fight, because they are themselves culpable, both as players, but also sometimes really as perpetrators. And so these together, I think that from the media industry level, if you look at things broadly, they present the fault lines that create room for attacks on press freedom. The last one here, perhaps I'd argue, is a certain sense of inertia. So when journalists have been attacked, when media organizations are attacked, you would wish the media to take it up with vehemence and to really persecute an agenda towards justice for whoever has been attacked. Oftentimes, it is left as a case for that person or that media organization, rather than the media rallying and fighting that creeping, attack that is coming into the space. And so that, I think, is a worry. If media would rally anytime somebody is attacked and really make sure that there is a consistent, concerted effort towards bringing the issues up and getting duty bearers to become more alert that, look, people will chase us if these things continue, then perhaps some of these attacks may stop. In terms of the legal issues, even though we've had the RTI passed, we've seen, when I've spoken with colleagues at Media Foundation for West Africa, who have done a very marvelous job since the RTI was passed in testing it. So they take requests to public institutions to test their readiness and also willingness to comply with the demands of the law. And sometimes some of the stories they tell are funny. You go to an institution to submit your request, and once they know you're bringing a request, the officer who should be receiving it is running away, literally running away, because it is when they receive it that they are bound to supply you the information. But if they don't receive your request, then so there are those loopholes. But they also remain on our books, even though we have decriminalized speech by canceling the criminal libel law. There remain laws in our Electronic Communications Act, and I forget the other one, that allow room for people with power to still criminalize speech. So when a journalist does their job, it is easy to still call on, say, provisions in the Electronic Communications Act that about causing fear and panic. And it is easy to call on that law to say this journalist, in doing his or her work, was causing fear and panic and therefore should be subjected to the full rigors of the law. And so that concern remains on the legal front. In fact, recently, the Media Foundation for West Africa, the Ghana Independent Broadcasters Association, I think Community Radio Network, I forget which other institutions, came together to hold a press conference to call on the president to initiate processes towards expunging those provisions from these laws, because otherwise we say we've decriminalized speech, but we are actually only pretending about it. There is also the question...
Sorry, if I can just step in just one more minute.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's fine. I'm almost done. There's also the question of the posturing of the law courts, which is a concern to journalists. So when journalists have been attacked, the law courts are not in a hurry to provide justice. Justice must be delivered, but should be seen to have been delivered also. But the posturing is such that it is so slow, and sometimes it's actually antagonistic towards journalists. Recently, a judge called Anas a terrorist, when it is actually Anas who had taken, Anas Arimia is an investigative journalist, when it was he who had taken a story, a case to the court. So there is that. There is also regulatory gaps. Even though we have that big media space, broadcasting space, we still don't have any law that regulates broadcasting. And not too long ago, we had two young boys who had come together to kill another young boy. And their reason was because they saw on TV a juju man who said, if you killed that person, you were going to get rich. And so there's content on media that shouldn't be on media if we really had laws on broadcasting. And that remains a sore point that as a country, we may need to pay attention to. So I'll leave it here. I'm hoping that during the discussions, some of the points I have on the individual level factors, we'll have opportunity to discuss them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Abina, and sorry to cut you off. We just want to reserve 30 minutes at the end for some questions and answers. But that was really a very insightful presentation, and it's given us an awful lot to think about. Our second speaker is a television presenter and the co-host of both Media Today on TV Africa, as well as the radio show, The City Breakfast Show. He was one of the main speakers at the 2015 TEDx Accra event, He's renowned for his photographic work with Ghana Investment Promotion Centre, Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development, as well as over 40 different private organisations and multinationals. He has a passion to empower, build people, build capacity, character, and confidence. So a big welcome to David Kwaku Saforo Saki. Thank you, David. You're just muted there, David. If I could just get you to unmute yourself, sorry.
Okay, we're good. Thank you very much, Kingsley. It's like I said earlier, it's an honor to be here. Just a couple of clarifications. I used to host the Media Today a few years ago, and in 2016, I was together with another host, a co-host of the City Breakfast Show. Currently, I host Breakfast Daily on City TV, so that's my current assignment that I'm on. Yes, let me just open up by saying that, and I'll share my screen shortly. Open up by saying that I feel that one of the important premises that we need to have as media practitioners is that in the space that we function, media is in direct opposition and aligned against many interest groups that seek to cover their practices in an attempt to get to where it is that they, suppose they want to go in terms of, look, our business, this is what we consider to be success. At the end of the day, our jobs as media persons is to uncover the dirty deeds in society, ostensibly to shape a better society, and so because our work is in direct collision with many interest groups, automatically, whether we're in Ghana, anywhere on the continent, or anywhere in the world, there are a lot of people who don't like us. It's as simple as that, be it on TV, be it on radio, be it out in the streets, people don't like us. We find that there are many people who have, we've had instances where people have barged into TV studios, to attack journalists, barged into radio stations to attack journalists and so on. But, it's a growing society. I also want to say this as well, that I think that a lot of the practice we have, we need to put it in context. The fact that this is a 30-year-old democracy, as it were, I'm counting from 1992, okay, means that I think that asking the question, African regional champion, to answer it, you have to be fair. And in being fair, you have to look at the context, in terms of how long have we functioned as a democracy? Because we would imagine, or we would say that the media practice in terms of freedoms of speech or freedom of speech is in the context of democratic, practice. So if we're going to do that, then we say that we have to look at the democracies around the world and look at us and say, within a 30-year period, this is what we've achieved. This is where we find ourselves. Now, is it good or bad? Then we can start to have that conversation. And that's just a premise to start that. Let me just share my screen quickly, and then we can just get into that. Let me just progress. So sorry, just jumping ahead of myself. All right, so like I said, it's a matter of context, and context in terms of history, as well as how much progress have we really made. And then also I feel that context in terms of international community and other things that are happening around the world. I love something that Abena mentioned. When we look globally, we realize that journalistic attacks have actually increased around the world. So even some of the shining lights in terms of those who've done well also have their own challenges in terms of increases in attacks around the world. So then the question is Ghana, in isolation? Is it something that has to be of grave concern because something untoward is happening here? Or is this something that we're seeing around the world and saying that let's do what we can to fix our issues, but truly it's a global phenomenon that's going on. All right, now let's go back again and look at where Ghana was. And again, there's a lot of things that Abna mentioned that I'll be referring to because that's, you know, how I built my presentation as well. Now, where Ghana was, Section 112 of the Criminal Code, you know, there was the offense of negligent as well as intentional libel, okay? And of course, that has been repealed. It was repealed in 2001. Thankfully, you know, much of that was gone. Unfortunately, some of it has remained, okay? And so you realize that the false publication bit, which is what Abna was trying to refer to, okay, false publication bit is still there. So where you can be taken up on the aspect of false publication. So it's an issue that we have to deal with. Now the question is that, was it an oversight or was it deliberate? Did some persons need to leave something of that law still there so that they could, you know, do whatever they want with it, or it was an oversight? Well, we're going to have to address that one day, sooner or later. And a lot of civil society organizations are pushing, as Abna again alluded to get this thing, you know, to get rid of it once and for all. Now, if you look at what Freedom House published, said that in terms of the good things that have happened in terms of Ghana, freedom of the press is constitutionally guaranteed and generally respected in practice, which is true in terms of my experience. Ghana has a diverse, yes, a vibrant media landscape. Again, I've now alluded to that. It includes both state and privately owned television and radio stations, as well as a number of independent newspapers and magazines. Now, the online news media has blossomed, you know, and is doing quite well. However, again, those of you who are in the Ghanaian media space will know that their space has to be properly regulated as well, because a lot of issues of fake news and all those other things, and people feeling that they are, you know, keyboard warriors, as it were, to just hide behind the keyboard and just type whatever they want without with impunity, you know, because nobody really comes for you as in that sense until it escalates to a level where now the police will come into it and all that. So we need to regulate that space a bit better. In 2010, we were first on the continent. Okay, then we dropped, you know, down to 27th, then 30th, and then we dropped down to 60, 62, and that's where we find ourselves. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of improvement in press freedom, generally speaking, okay? You know, organizations like GIBA, you know, and other civil society organizations as well have pushed hard for government and governments, you know, over the years to deal more fairly with journalists. And, you know, people have won court cases. And also there was an experience that I read about recently. There was an issue with a reporter from the Finder newspaper where, and this one, I'm highlighting this because it came to me as some kind of progress that, you know, we seem to have made and are making. The reporter was in a public transport vehicle, and a policeman, you know, did a random spot check and wanted to harass the driver of the vehicle. Now, the reporter noticed that the policeman appeared drunk, so decided to film the whole incident. In his process of filming, he then realizes that the policeman sees him and realizes that he didn't have the capacity to effect an arrest, so calls for his colleagues who were down the road. They came and arrested him, took him to the police station. Now, the guy reports to his editor, and the editor gets there. And the question was, what was the reason for the arrest? So the commander at the police station tells him everything. And he says, this guy was filming, number one, a public officer and in the public interest. So therefore, on what basis are you arresting him? The commander quickly then apologizes and frees the reporter to go on his way. And the policeman, offending policeman, thinking that he had won a quick victory, had followed, up to the police station to come and, see what was happening, only to him then getting arrested and queried as to why he was out at work and getting drunk, And so for me, a practical example of there's some amount of progress that it's not just blind arrests and blind prosecution. There's this level of thinking through what the real issue is and deal with it, and then make progress forward. Now, I want to look at the international community, where we find ourselves within the concept of international community and what else is going on around the world. So on the 3rd of May, when the rankings were put out, 180 countries covered in the rankings, the World Press Freedom Rankings. Those in the very serious conditions, 31 countries. There's 42 in difficult ones. The problematic ones where Ghana finds itself is in 55 countries, and they're good or satisfactory in 52 countries, all right? So Ghana finds itself in the problematic category. Now let's take a look at what the map actually looks like. And if you can see where the countries that are generally seen as good in terms of the rankings, and it says here good or satisfactory. Also, we look at Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Namibia, and then Argentina, and then you go to the States. Most of Western Europe is there, and then Canada. Now, I'm bringing this up because I really, as I was going through and preparing for this, I kind of felt that is there, an overly, there's over too much attention being put on bad press or bad incidents that are happening against journalists in Ghana, or it's not just a global phenomenon of these things that are going on that we need to just be fairer about it. So we will get into some of that in just a little bit. So again, I made reference to this. We're 62 now, but there's something that we talked about earlier. We talked about the pluralism. Now, there are two things that the World Press Freedom uses for its indexing. Okay, the score is calculated based on two things. One, the level of pluralism. Now, the pluralism is fantastic because we have a lot of media houses in Ghana, and it's great, right? Now, it also says the independence of the media. The question that I like to ask in terms of independence of the media is, who owns these media houses? Now, there's a lot of private ownership, but you would also find that among the private ownership, there's quite a fair number of them that are actually owned by politicians. Okay, so when you look at press houses that are owned by politicians, here comes the question: what line will they be towing as journalists on the station that are owned by politicians? Okay, and now when we look at that, then you ask yourself, okay, if you have a media house that appears to be independent and appears to fulfill the status of being a plural media landscape, but then you have a lot of people that are, doing the bidding of their bosses, and some of these bosses are politicians, then is it really an independent landscape? I don't know. We can, when we get to the Q&A, we'll see if maybe Abner can help us with some answers on this one, because I don't have answers for that, you know, but it's just something that came to mind and I wanted to bring it up. Now, other things that are happening around the world. What I've done is that this is a PDF document, so I'll share it, but just for the sake of the presentation, so you can see immediately what these links are leading to. So the stories of okay, let me, I think I shared the, give me a second, let me just pull up an updated document. Sorry, just give me a second. I'll do that right now. Okay. Okay, here we go. All right, there we go. So this is where we are. I don't know if you can still see it. Can you see it? All right, good. So what I've done is that the links are here, but you can immediately see the screenshots of the front page where the story is, right? So in The Guardian, we have this, this headline here. My aim in bringing this across is just to say that it's actually happening everywhere. There are challenges in different places and it's happening everywhere, okay? So the police admit to an unlawful arrest of a journalist, okay? Let's go on. 67 UK journalists arrested and or charged, okay, in their jobs since 2011, all right? We'll go to another one here. Journalists arrests could be commonplace under the public order bill. Campaigners are warning about this. All right, let's go on. I'll quickly breeze through this part because you can always deal with that later in the Q&A. Yeah, so here we go, another set of headlines. This one, I think I don't have the media. Okay, so the media house on this one, yes, but it's in 2022, 15 journalists arrested, face more charges. Let me just quickly see if I can. Okay, so there's Press Freedom Tracker. That's where that is coming from. You have that there. Then we have PEN America asking the questions, why were 6 journalists arrested in Washington, D.C.? So you see that. I'm just trying to show that even in the areas where the map shows the yellow color, where ostensibly they have good practice, there are challenges. Now, look at this Press Freedom article by VOA. At least 117 journalists detained, arrested, covering protests. That's what they were doing, covering protests, okay? Protests are going on, you're covering the protests and you've been arrested and detained, okay? So again, we ask the question, press freedom, freedom of speech. Here you have it. It's happening in different places. So the question again is it just a Ghana thing? Is it just an African thing? Is there more to the conversation? All right.
David, if I can just pause you there, just one more minute, if you may. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I'll quickly breeze through the rest. So again, there's more to it, and you can see other headlines. There's BBC talking about Australia broadcaster loses his legal challenge. The police barged into the national station in Australia, you know, the national broadcaster, and this is what happened. And so you can go through, read those stories. The links are all in the document there, and we can. So it's happening in Germany, it's happening in France, it's happening in different places. Okay, now, question: is there anything to celebrate about where we find ourselves? I think so. Okay, largely we've done pretty impressively because since 1996, I remember I was in it was in second year of uni, and you know, private media just broke out in Ghana, and it's been growing ever since. We have currently, as third quarter of last year, 155 authorized stations. 113 of them are currently on air. We have 528 radio stations, and the breakdown is there. Like what Abner said, we are saturated, we are oversaturated, you know, in terms of media, right? Now, talk about the RTI law. This law was passed. Now, according to the Minister of Information, over 1,000 requests have been made for this to the commission, okay, on RTI. Now, 838 have been granted, 47 rejected, with 45 of them being transferred. Now, 838, and that's my focus, out of over 1,000 requests that have been made. I think that's something to celebrate, okay, as opposed to overly being negative about where we find ourselves. That's something to celebrate. Now, of course, the details, we need to go into it, what it is and all of that.
David, I'll just stop you there if that's okay.
Okay, I'm at the end. I'm at the end.
Yeah, but those are you know, some very important observations, talking about the context in which we should be having this discussion. I now turn to our third speaker, who's a PhD student at the Institute here. He's been with Amnesty International Norway for over 15 years and has led and managed and worked on various projects, including on freedom of expression and human rights defenders, arms control, the death penalty. And he has worked on an LLM, but his doctoral thesis is on China's media influence on press freedom in Africa, an examination of agency in the Ghanaian context. So a very warm welcome to Richard Duomo. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by saying a bit that I'm holding this keynote address actually in my capacity as a research student at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and not in my capacity as Amnesty International employee. I need to make that distinction because of my dual role. Having said that, I hope you can all see my slides.
Yes.
Right. Having said that, on the question of whether Ghana is an African regional champion for freedom of expression, my short answer is that in practice, Ghana is no longer a good example for freedom of expression in Africa. Like Dr. Abuna said, there are good reasons to still see Ghana as a good example, but a champion, but I don't think it's a good example. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. Mr. Chairman, I would like to also point out that my PhD research focused on China's media influence on press freedom in Africa. And I'm doing an instrumental case study of Ghana on the question of agency. More specifically, I'm trying to examine the role that Ghanaian journalists and politicians receiving training in China play in localizing aspects of their training learnings in Ghana and the impact it has on press freedom thereof. As part of my research, I've conducted over 30 interviews with journalists, politicians, and other media stakeholders during an 8-week fieldwork trip to Ghana last summer. And I'd very much like to share some insights from the preliminary results of my research by focusing on the possible China angle to this topic at hand. I can tell Dr. Abuna and my colleague have done a good job at focusing on the structural problems on this discussion, but I'll focus on the interest. To do this, I've divided my presentation into 4 parts, and I'll quickly look at the protection, enjoyment, and contradictions of press freedom in Ghana's Fourth Republic, then move on to competing foreign interests from the West and East, and here I mean China. Then take a look at the question of whether Ghanaian elites are no longer willing to protect free expression in Ghana's democracy, and then draw a few concluding remarks. On the first one, as a concept, Reporters Without Borders define press freedom in terms of the ability of the journalist to, and I quote, select, produce, and disseminate news in the public interest, independent of political, economic, legal, and social interference, and most importantly, in the absence of threat to their physical and mental safety. And in my opinion, this is exactly what Chapter 12, Article 162 of Ghana's present constitution guarantees. Provisions 1 to 4 expressly guarantee the freedom and independence of the press and prohibits, among other things, censorship, interference, or harassment by government for publishers' editorial opinions and views. Simply put, the Constitution provides effective guarantees for press freedom and privileged means for the media's news gathering and dissemination. Arguably, though, the first 2 decades of the Fourth Republic saw the enjoyment of the most liberal media atmosphere in Ghana, As Professor Gajeko once wrote about the first decade, and I quote, "Glaring flaws of the private press were overlooked because an unfettered press was deemed preferable to the culture of silence era from which the country had just emerged." Again, the repeal of the criminal libel laws in 2001, as Dr. Abner already mentioned, further enabled Ghana's press freedom to flourish during the second decade in particular, and earned the country a fine reputation within the Committee of Nations, including for being a great example and champion for press freedom in Africa. But in the last decade, however, we've seen a semblance of the return of culture of silence that characterized the infamous military days. Afrobarometer opinion polls show that the uncritical support for media freedom in Ghana has dwindled amidst highly unforgiving attitudes for media lapses and excesses. The declining fortunes of press freedom in Ghana unprecedented attacks on journalists and media houses by the national security apparatus, as Dr. Abena already mentioned, especially by the police, as well as state appointees and operatives of political parties. For instance, as a reminder, while no journalist was actually recorded killed in the first decades of the Fourth Republic, 2 have been killed in the last decade, with several others or their media houses attacked for exercising their press freedom. Other cases of, if you will, media freedom violations include hate speech, attempts to subvert constitutional media provisions, and the growing use of lawsuits by state officials to punish free press. Again, Dr. Abena has gone through most of these structural problems, so I wouldn't want to bore you by giving you a repetition, and I hope we can take some questions on them later on. I'll move on to competing foreign interests. Mr. Chairman, it is no gainsaying that there are growing foreign interests in resource-rich and stable Ghana. Yet competing interests in the media industry in recent times had Professor Kwame Karikari, for example, asking whether the media sphere is the new frontier for external control. And this is because the lack of adequate state investment in the media industry, especially in the private area, has meant that journalism education, training, and media infrastructure have in part had to depend on foreign aid. Depending on where the aid is coming from, they equally tend to epitomize the media ideology of the sending state. Aid from the West tend to typify the libertarian media model, whereas those from China tend to reflect the authoritarian media model. And to this end, media equipment and technical assistance from China tend to largely strengthen the capacity of the state-owned media, while the West have generally extended assistance to both the private and the state-owned media. Media alliances with China, especially through the South-South Cooperation Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and Belt and Road initiatives, also seek to emphasize state information and media control, whereas those with the West, for example, the UK's Media Coalition Alliance, invariably seek to promote and maintain the concept of the free press. As David already mentioned, there are numerous examples of press freedom violations across the world. And China is seen as an embodiment of one authoritarian system that is strengthening, if not spreading, these values against fundamental freedoms. And in one area that China has become great or developed interest in has to do with foreign media training. This has become an area of huge influence and competition. Chinese trainings for journalists and politicians alike tend to embody its constructive top-down journalism approach, while those from the West emphasize the watchdog journalism approach. In a surprising turn of events, though, Ghana has emerged among countries such as Tanzania and Ethiopia as top recipient countries of Chinese trainings, measured by the number of short-term seminars and training programs attended in China. Besides journalists, we have politicians such as ministers, members of parliament, top political party officials, as well as senior civil servants at the ministries who have all attended these trainings in China. And the topics include governance, political party organization, development, information control, and media approach. Despite the huge Chinese investment in these, often all expenses paid for trips to China, Beijing insists the trainings are intended to show knowledge of its society and the ways of doing things for a better understanding, and not intended to foist its models on anyone. But soft power is an integral tool in China's foreign policy arsenal. So we can assume that Beijing is without doubt parading its models and norms as alternatives to democracy and human rights-based development, with the hope that some will find it expedient to use their own agency to copy and localize aspects of their trainings in their countries. So the ultimate question for me, and maybe for you, is, are the Ghanaian journalists and politicians attending this training equally taking the bait? And if yes, what impact is that having on press freedom in Ghana? Mr. Chairman, the preliminary results regarding the participating journalists show that the overwhelming majority do not subscribe to the Chinese media system and do not intend to practice it in Ghana. However, the political development in the last decade points to Ghanaian elites being at a crossroads. In its 2022 report on Beijing's global media influence, Freedom House projected a limited Chinese media influence in Ghana to date. However, the report warned that Ghana's political leaders have developed close ties with Beijing and are barely critical of the bilateral relationship. It further actually noted that some in the political system are willing to cooperate with Chinese Communist Party influence efforts. By the way, this report was co-written by Dr. Aisi, who is also at the University of Ghana Communications Department. Ghanaian politicians are seemingly facing a time inconsistency problem, where previous imperatives that were optimal in defending and protecting press freedom appear to no longer suffice. In my recent interviews with recipient politicians of Chinese training from both sides of the aisle, many question the usefulness of an unfettered free press that does not facilitate developmental processes, but only criticizes. While echoing criticisms of the largely failed democracy dividends in the form of economic development in Africa and Ghana, others have been quick to register their willingness to infuse Chinese elements that will help undo abject poverty in Ghana. For example, in a response to a question on his learnings from China and changes he would like to effect in Ghana, a respondent member of parliament said, and I quote, "I think our freedom is too much. I believe that if I have my way and I can change things, I think their style," and here I mean Chinese style, "half autocracy, half democracy is the best theory for Africa, not wholesale democracy." So here we see, and as some politicians who are beginning to detest the idea of wholesale democracy in Ghana. This frustration with Ghana's democracy, with a robust media, but without much economic progress to show for, is one that ran through most of my interviews with politicians and other media stakeholders. Eager to learn from China's rapid economic development processes, but limited by the shackles of democratic tenets. Some are seemingly willing to sit on the fence in the face of blatant violations to press freedom, if not stoking the fires under such violations themselves. While there is no concrete evidence of this being a purposive government policy position, and I need to repeat that, I found no evidence that this is a government deliberate policy. Individual elites, however, political party officials, and some state appointees and agencies face the dilemma in which their short-term quest to blunt dissent and criticism of the government are at odds with the long-term democratic imperatives for defending and protecting press freedom in Ghana. It is as if these Ghanaian elites no longer see the value of free expression in Ghana's budding democracy. In a series of analyses in 2022, the Executive Director of Media Foundation for West Africa, Mr. Sulemana Brahima, noted and I quote, phenomenal surge in repression, oppression, and intimidation by a government that is increasingly becoming despotic rather than democratic. Again, this behavior in parts has seen Ghana drop 30 places in 2022 and 2 more places in 2023 on the Global Press Freedom Index.
Richard, if I can just ask you to respectfully come to a conclusion, only because we have a few questions now, and I want to make sure we've got about 20 or 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. But what you're saying is really important, though. So please continue, but maybe just another minute or two. Thank you.
Right. I'll just quickly come to conclusion. I wish to point out that although the advent of social media has made them more pervasive, the reckless, unprofessional practices in the media and by the media are barely new developments. What is rather new is the fact that the political development in Ghana, at least in the last decade, has exemplified a flawed democratic dispensation. There's a seeming shift from one of a beacon of democracy to a semi-democracy where the contempt for free speech is incrementally becoming the norm. I therefore repeat my position that although Ghana in principle presents one of the robust protection frameworks for press freedom in Africa, in practice, it is not a good example of a champion for freedom of expression in Africa. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Richard. And that was a really interesting discussion about the role of external actors, including China in the landscape, and how questions are now being asked about whether or not sort of half autocracy and half democracy is better than full democracy for Africa, which is, a fascinating element. I now want to just move to some questions, and I'm going to open questions with one of my own, and then I will read them out from the group. And if maybe we can just spend only 2 or 3 minutes answering each question, then we'll manage to get through them, because I do plan to finish at 2 o'clock sharp. The first question is around, a gendered lens to this question. And I noted that Dr. Abina has done some work on gender. So this is really for you. We know that globally, women journalists and media workers face increasing online and offline attacks and are subject to often very specific threats. And this is a global problem all over the world. And I was wondering, therefore, whether this sort of gendered attacks against women in the media is an issue in Ghana, and if so, what is being done about it, and what can be done about it?
We have evidence from a 2020 study that we did on the status of women in the Ghanaian media. It's a broad scoping study, really, of women, what they're doing, where they stand, etc. But among the things that we explored in the study was the incidence of harassment, for instance. And we did find that these women suffered harassment. I think it was 20% of them, at least, that said that they had been at the receiving end of harassment. If you juxtapose this to what we saw in the recently published State of the Ghanaian Media report, particularly the chapter on safety of journalists, we see also a sense of gendering in the forms of attacks that journalists would suffer. So, for instance, males are more likely to suffer physical attacks, whereas females would suffer verbal attacks. So there is some gendering in attacks on free expression, where these attacks are directed at individual media practitioners rather than obviously organizations. And so we see that what can be done, what is being done, we don't have as much, at least as we would wish, attention going to the gendered sides of the Ghanaian media. The problem seemed to be being tackled at macro level, and in which case it puts everything together and tries to address them. But I'm, for instance, part of a grassroots organizations, the Alliance for Women in Media Africa, and we see that those are the places where responses to the gendered cases of harassment and attacks on journalists are being addressed from, rather than from the systemic level. It's more media development organizations, associations that seem to be going for the cases that they see and try and address them. So the Alliance for Women in Media Africa, of which I'm a steering committee member, for instance, is implementing projects that enable women to better protect themselves, for instance, is implementing projects that make media organizations, media owners, media bosses more gender aware, so that perhaps they would pursue policies that are more gender sensitive. For instance, it's published also, for instance, a gender sensitive code for media in Africa. It's published a manual on harassment, anti-harassment. So there are things like that being done on the grassroots level, often with funding from international partners. And I mean, you listen to Richard and you know that as much as we are happy to have these funding sources available, through the back door, there are questions to be asked also about the intentions behind some of these monies that are helping to fight some of the challenges that we see in the media.
Thanks very much, Abina. And we've had a few questions come in, some really interesting ones. I'll start by one that was sort of answered just briefly by David, but perhaps this is a question for you. I'll re-ask it. The question is, in West Africa, I believe that radio is still the most important source of news and commentary at local levels. Are there significant differences in freedom of the press on local radio compared with at the national level?
Anything I say will be anecdotal rather than empirically, validated, because we don't as yet, at least not to my knowledge, have any research that directly addresses the differentials in press freedom attacks as happen on the grassroots level versus the national level. But I can imagine a situation where, because local level radio stations tend to be poorer funded or resourced, because they are run often by politicians who just use them when we're nearing elections to champion their campaign messages. So really, the 4 years between elections, well, 3.5 years between key campaigning periods, these media houses are very poorly funded, and their employees are basically left to the wind to fend for themselves however they can. That makes them open to susceptibility, cooptation, but also attacks on them. So I would dare say that the attacks may be perhaps easier, likely to happen at the grassroots level, although they may not as much be reported or blown out of scheme. And I hear David when he says, actually, some of what we are seeing is because there's quite a lot of talk about these things. I think that when they happen to the media practitioners in Accra, in the cities, where the media and organizations have a lot of influence across the country, the stories carry more weight and reach more people. And so it appears as though it's the Accra journalists that are being attacked. But I fear it may be even happening more commonly at the ground level without us being aware of them, because of just how small the journalists in these media organizations appear in the grand scheme of things.
Thank you. I see, David, you've got your hand up there too. Would you like to add something?
Yes, I wanted to say that, so because in media practice, radio is local and TV is national, right? So because of that, you tend to find that, yes, there will be challenges with the local radio stations across the country in different places. The question is, what's their reach, in terms of how effectively can they communicate what is going on with them where they find themselves, maybe 300 kilometers from Accra. for their issues to become nationalized, right? And this is some of the challenges that they will by all means face, right? Recently, there was this issue with somebody walked, into a radio station in Tamale to go and heckle someone in the radio station. It happens, right? But then how will it get national interest? Well, because radio is by nature local, unless you have stations like ours at City FM that's franchised across the country on partner stations, it's very easy for something to happen in your corner and not get noticed, and not brought to the national attention.
Right. Thanks, David. This is I think a question perhaps best asked of Richard. The fact that this is what the question is, the fact that Ghana has fallen in the Freedom Index is very worrying. It's important we focus on it, but compared to other African states, it's actually not too bad or not as bad. And that's something that's come out in the discussions. The question is, has Ghana's journalists taken these concerns to the Commonwealth, which has pledged to uphold media freedom? So is there any relationship between what the Commonwealth has said or could do and some of the issues that we've discussed now that you would like to touch on, Richard, or anybody else?
Yeah, I can respond briefly to that. I'm not aware of the journalists taking this to the Commonwealth, but I'm pretty much aware from my discussion with them of their view of the freedom they have granted by the Constitution, and more so the, if you will, free press or system or libertarian system that was passed on to Ghana from independence and has been practiced for the most part in Ghana. They understand their role as journalists, and they prefer this watchdog role that they play. So when I asked them the question of whether what they're learning from China would affect their more or less watchdog journalistic practice, majority will say no, because we think this is what is good for Ghana, and this is what we are used to. Even though we get, in school, we get the training in both developmental journalism and watchdog journalism. They end up doing more watchdog because that is what the practice is in Ghana. So I'm not overly aware if they take this to the Commonwealth, basically.
Okay, thanks, Richard. This next question, maybe I'll start with you, Abina, and I don't know if David, you want to answer it as well. What has been the impact of COVID-19, if any, on freedom of expression and media freedom in Ghana?
Well, at least from the evidence we gathered in our State of the Ghanaian Media Reports, the chapter on media viability, quite a bit. COVID has affected the purse strings of media, has affected the financial inflows into media. And as I've made the point already, when the media is not financially viable, it can become susceptible to all sorts of attacks, including even the more latent ones that come in the form of cooptation and corruption. We saw from the chapter or that study that media organizations are struggling to make ends meet, partly because COVID has, well, as the politicians insist is the reason, has killed the Ghanaian economy, COVID and Ukraine. And so it is the reason dollar exchange rates are high, and these media organizations are using technology not made in Ghana, they are importing, and so they must change a lot of CDs that they are not getting from advertising to be able to import technology. Technology, the lifespan of technology changes very quickly also, and so retooling is a real cost center that, because COVID has affected their inflows, is a problem for them. That and other considerations make COVID a real challenge to media organizations. However, we also saw that COVID has introduced newer models of income that in the long run, we hope and believe may turn the table and make media begin to be a bit more viable. For instance, COVID has highlighted the value of the digital. and how not to sit back and worry about how it is taking away traditional advertising resources. But now media organizations are leveraging the digital to increase their resource inflows. We think that is a good thing. And in fact, in the chapter, we encourage more intervention that empowers local media, smaller media organizations to be able to do a bit of that. So COVID has been a mixed blessing, I might argue.
All right, thanks, Sabina. And David, did you want to comment on the impact of COVID on the media landscape and media freedom?
I would say that it's pretty much, my thoughts are pretty much in the same direction as Abner's own, because I've seen it. At the COVID came in probably 2 years just after the TV station had started. Now, radio station had been around for 15, 16 years at the time when COVID came in, but TV was fresh. TV was just like 1.5 to 2 years old when TV came, TV started, but it then afforded us the opportunity to do community-based, reality-based, developmental broadcasting, right? And that has since stuck. So that's one of the things that for me has been, the impact. When we look at the impact and we say something positive, for me, that's one of them. But then I also agree with Abner in the sense that online media practice became like super viable. It became like, this is the new direction, this is the way to go. And so now every TV station, every radio station has some form of online facility that supports whatever they're doing, whether it's on the FM frequencies or it's on television. They also have an online side of that as well. So in terms of impact, that's what I would say.
Thanks, David. The next question is, to what extent, if any, have journalist unions played a role in upholding media freedom in Ghana? And to what degree has political partisanship affected the Ghanaian media, if at all? Sabina, would you like to jump in on that, or Richard?
Yeah. So the union, the local associations, we have particularly the Ghana Journalists Association, GIBA. The GIBA is the Independent Broadcasters Association. They tend to come in when issues of regulation, because they secure licenses to be able to operate the local broadcasting organizations. And so they come in when they think that the regulator is stifling them, including even through too much taxation and levying. And so that there's some, organizing and activity when the regulator is trying to get at them like that. The Ghana Journalists Association and the Independent Newspaper Private Independent Newspaper Publishers Association, they also do a bit of work. But for the most part, really, I think that the real job of promoting media freedom and fighting for it has been media development organizations led, and with Media Foundation for West Africa at the front, with nobody in comparison, really. And our study actually says that the journalists, the media people think that it is the Media Foundation that is fighting for media freedom in Ghana, rather than even their own associations. The Journalist Association tends to issue press releases, for instance, when somebody has been attacked, including in some instances, the direction of their releases displeasing journalists, because it tends rather to if you like, I don't know what the better word to use, but rather than going after the attacker, tends to take the note of the journalist should do better to, that kind of voice. And then so that sort of, even if it doesn't legitimize, it empowers the attacker to do more because it's the journalist's fault, basically. So in terms of organizing, I'm not too sure the associations have been that forefront in fighting attacks against press freedom. Recently, I was in a meeting where the president of the Ghana Journalists Association announced that they are planning to turn the association into a union, and that also would then have bargaining power to fight for better conditions of service for their employees, and in so doing, hopefully improve the well-being of journalists. But in terms of actual attacks on journalists and fighting it, I think it is the Media Foundation for West Africa that stands in the lead as the advocate and the activist.
Right. Thanks, Vida. Richard, did you want to add anything to that?
Just a quick one. Dr. Abner already mentioned, but I want to point out that the GIBA, for example, the Ghana Independent Journalists Association, they have actually been the ones that have been at the forefront of averting the process or attempts to subvert constitutional media provisions in 2015, when the parliament passed the LI 2224 provisions that the Constitution, the Supreme Court of Ghana, eventually said amounted to censorship and overturned it. So it was the GIBA that actually took this situation to this case to court and fought through and won at the highest level of law in Ghana. So I need to just mention that as well. And the fact that we have politicians who are owning or fully, partly associated with ownership of media organizations, it also points to the fact where most of the media culture over there is one of clientelism and more of partisanship. So there's barely that kind of objective reportage that you find from those media houses that have politicians from both sides of the aisle. And majority of them also go to China and learn, and they want to carry out their journalism outlets in different ways from what we've been known to. So the politicians are actually affecting many ways, I would say, have a negative impact on the protection of press freedom in Ghana. Whereas we have the associations, they have problems, but some have been very stout in terms of defending press freedom in Ghana.
My next question is related to sort of, what role are unions playing or able to play? I mean, we all know that, media freedom and freedom of expression is just one of the full bundle of human rights concerns that all countries have. And this is really, I think, a question perhaps first for you, Richard, because of your work on a variety of human rights issues over the years. I'm interested to know more generally how it is at the moment in Ghana for civil society to function overall. We're seeing all over the world a closing of space for civil society to operate. And I'm wondering whether or not this is a phenomenon that's being reflected in Ghana as well. How would you assess the ability of civil society to do its important work more generally in Ghana at the moment? Richard.
Yeah, thank you. From the literature that I've reviewed, it sounds to me like institute like where the Democratic Center for Democratic Development in Ghana and many other and Media Foundation, for example, have always been very strong and robust in going out with their protection activities. To be honest with you, had it not been, like Dr. Abner emphasized, had it not been the Media Foundation's work, both in terms of protecting free press and as well as the Right to Information Act, which they've actually tested, gone to court, lost, but still been able to test it to the limit, we wouldn't know much about what is going on in Ghana. And I would say that the civil society organization is still strong. It's one of the reasons why, in fact, I wouldn't be able to say for sure that Ghana is not a champion, because we have a strong civil society organizations that are actually able to take on the government, able to push the government to the limit. So in that sense, I'm not very worried. What I'm worried about is the promulgation of, if it was statutory laws by parliament that will highly limit, for example, media, press freedom, enjoyment. And yet I think we have a civil society organization that is quite robust and will probably fight such attempts by the government or the parliament to limit press freedom. So I'm not worried about the civil society organizations, to be honest with you.
Thanks, Richard. Another question, and this may be our last question given the time, but we'll see how we go. I might reframe it a little bit. These drops in press rankings that we've been talking about, to what extent are they taken seriously by the government by politicians, by the media, by the people living in Ghana. Is there a perception that these are rankings from predominantly Western organizations? Whether or not, are they considered, neutral organizations assessing press freedom based on objective criteria, or is there, some suspicion about these findings? And I think David touched that on that briefly. Maybe David, you want to add something, but I'll invite all of you to jump in on that.
Yeah, the challenge is in terms of, someone like Bernal, of course, you're very much involved in, mine is a bit tunnel vision in terms of, I work with one media house. Of course, I interact with others, but my work is in one media house. And we have over the years been very, in your presentation, you made mention of some of the challenges that the media practitioners, as in journalists, go through. For example, you mentioned something about low professionalism and so on. And these are some of the factors that lend itself to exposing or overexposing journalists to attacks, right? For us, there's also the way of thinking that says there's a way to carry out your work. And if you want to stay safe, there's a way to carry out your work without necessarily diminishing the impact of what you're trying to do, right? And so you've got to make the right phone calls when you get into the space. So for example, if you're going into a national security zone, right, to go and cover a story, there's a way to go about it. You don't just arrive in a national security zone, without any identification as to where you're coming from. Because even when you have the identification, they still, if they're not expecting you, they feel jumped, as it were. So there's that. But then I also think that there is the perception among certain journalists, and I would say that I have often thought about it, and that's why I put it in the presentation, that maybe it's not a very fair assessment to say that we are where we are, considering the number of incidents that we see globally, and in some of the best places who have good rankings, we see that these challenges are happening there, and so how come they are not dropping in their ranks?
I'll ask Richard to jump on this too. The question is more directed not so much as to whether or not the rankings are objectively good or not. The question is more is sort of how are they perceived? What's the perception or the influence of them in Ghana?
In the society?
Yeah, okay. And maybe Richard, I can ask you, because we're about to finish in 1 minute. So maybe Richard, I can ask some, and Abina, some final reflections before we close.
Right. So quickly on that, it featured prominently in my interviews, and I realized that for the journalists I talked to, they worry that Ghana is plummeting down the ranking. But the politicians, there's a sense of double standards that I noticed, where when we were up there they were happy to talk about it, Ghana being out there. But when we plummeted, they will refer to it being, it's nothing to take serious. It's about changing methodological aspects in the whole process that is got Ghana to go down plummeting. So I see a sense of the politicians not taking it seriously when Ghana is falling down the rankings, but then the journalists are quite worried.
Okay, Abina, do you have a final reflection on that just before we close? Just a few sentences.
Yes, the other dimension to what the politicians do with it is it depends on whether they are in power or in opposition. When they are in power and we're plummeting, they say, well, this is not an objective measure. When they are in opposition, they are happy to say that government is failing. It is attacking journalists, and that's why we're failing. And so it depends on whether they are in power or in opposition. In the media ranks, I think that there is attention on it, but there are people like David who are beginning to ask questions about, is it really a good measure? And so that's perhaps is why when we launched the State of the Ghanaian Media Report, it received a lot of acceptance because people felt now there is something local that tells us the health of our media. Okay, thanks, Ben. And look, I just want to thank all of you so much for coming here today, making time. I mean, it's been such an interesting and important discussion, and I felt we could have kept talking for much longer. So I apologize for being strict with the time, but look, thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you to our audience, to our participants for turning up and being interested in this issue and for asking such great questions.